I'm Terri Hicklin. I'm here today with Danita Sorenson, and we're going to be having a discussion about autism, which is a word that I really didn't know much about until, maybe 10, 15 years ago. I don't know that I'd ever even heard of people being diagnosed with something called autism. So, Danita, welcome, and I'd like to ask you a little bit about your background.
Well, I am licensed as a speech pathologist, as a marriage and family therapist.
Okay, very good.
And those two things have blended together to get me involved, to continue my involvement with autism, which sort of happened accidentally.
Kind of organically. So you have been seeing patients here in Nevada County primarily?
No, here in, well, let's put that at the end, because I
Okay.
have been seeing kids up here.
Okay.
But I started out teaching, and then I decided I got fascinated with speech pathology, and I went in to study that. And at some point, I learned that, well, I was working as a speech therapist in Contra Costa County, and I had occasion to visit Langley Porter Psychiatric Facility, which is a psychiatric arm of UC Medical Center.
Okay.
And I had learned during my speech training that there was a speech therapist there. And so out of curiosity, when I had some vacation time, and I was in San Francisco, I made an appointment to go meet her and find out what she did and all that sort of thing. And it happened that I came there just at the end of a research project that the Children's Unit had been doing, where the research project involving autism.
Wow.
And they at that time, the prevailing notion still was going under the criteria that were developed by Leo Kanner. Leo Kanner was a professor at I wrote this down for myself. At Johns Hopkins Hospital, and he had noticed that he had some children that came to him that all had similar characteristics, and there were 8 of them, which I don't remember. They were, inability to make eye contact, insistence on the sameness, and these were personality kind of characteristics. But since they were all coming to him at the same time, he got kind of interested in this.
Sure.
And he studied them, but he had a select population because he was in Johns Hopkins University, and so they were pulling from the population there. So the kids that were referred to him mostly came from highly educated families, and that sort of thing.
Now, let me ask you, what years would this have been?
This was in the late 40s.
Oh, okay.
He at that time, one thing, I want a parenthetical statement here. One thing about autism, to have any sense of it as a real entity, you can't take it out of context. You have to think about it in terms of the political situations, the prevailing scientific things, and so on and so forth. And at that time that Kanner was doing this, the prevailing approach to psychology and psychiatry was Freudian. And so he was interested in, well, what are the parents of these kids like? And from his research of these things, he came up with the idea of refrigerator moms.
What would that be?
Well, that was mothers who were cold and not unfeeling and not expressive and so on and so forth. And it fit right in his whole Freudian framework. And so for a long time, that was the notion. These children are that way because they have mothers that have been inadequate as mothers, and they have developed this deep hatred of them and so on and so forth.
Wow.
Well, that was what everybody thought. And so moms got blamed. So the research that had been going on at Langley Porter was this: if indeed autism is a result of poor parenting, then one ought to be able to reverse that by giving good parenting.
Sure.
So they had a 2-year study where all the children who were there were on what would now be considered the really severe end of autism. And as I said, I just happened into this thing and found out what was going on there. And shortly thereafterward, found out that there was going to be an opening there, and so I applied for it.
It immediately attracted you. Now, what year would this
This
have
was
been?
in the early 60s.
Okay, so for at least 20, 25 years or so, the prevailing idea was based on the Freudian belief that it's all mom.
Yeah, that's all mom.
Wow.
And well, if you think about it, they were indeed pulling from a population where the parents were highly educated. Their fathers were mostly all in some form of science or math or that sort of thing.
Interesting.
And, excuse me. But no one else at the time thought to look at, well, what else is going on with those kids? And sometime fairly recently, someone thought to go back and look and say, well, what were the fathers doing? And they found there was so many of them that were working with chemicals, pesticides, all those kinds of things.
Interesting.
And nobody paid attention to that kind of thing.
Just easier to blame the mom.
Right, yeah. So anyway, when I came in there, though, the rate of autism at that time was 1 in 10,000.
Wow.
And that's, you have to really look at that because the definition has changed. The spectrum of, now it's known as an autism spectrum.
Yes.
So if we're going from very, very involved individuals to high functioning ones. So the numbers when they were saying 1 in 10,000, that was the severe the autistic. Yeah.
So you got your job basically kind of wandering in there and finding this study had been done. So then you worked in that field mostly in the speech and language and the things.
I was assigned to work on the children's unit. I was to be the speech pathologist and try to figure out how to get these kids to talk.
Okay.
And I came there at what I consider to be a very opportune time because there was a lot of support for approaching these kids and how to work with kids and to combine the efforts of the, quote, educational staff with the nursing staff and that sort of thing. That was about the same time, though, that in the 50s and such, that the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual came out. And they classified autism under childhood schizophrenia.
Oh, wow, really?
Yep. But it was also the time where there was starting to be now, initially there were no psych meds, but then medicine started bringing in medications, and so stimulants like Ritalin became known, and could we use this, and could we use that, and so on. So a lot was going on.
Yes.
And again, one of the things that was going on was the introduction of some more vaccines.
Yes, I definitely wanted to touch on that.
Okay, so when I first came there, the only required vaccinations were smallpox and DPT. And DPT was somewhat suspect because there was noticed that the pertussis part of that vaccine seemed to have cause a lot of physical problems. And so I came into what I thought was the hallowed grounds of the UC Medical Center, and I thought, gee, this is interesting. Some people here are questioning whether or not they should be doing this, because what's it doing? But anyway. This classification thing became interesting in a lot of ways, and I want to the politically and scientifically the interest in Freudian psychology was fading.
Yes.
And what was beginning to come in was an interest in behavioral therapy. And B.F. Skinner was doing a lot of writing and stimulus response kinds of things.
So this is still 50s, 60s?
Yeah, this is the 50s and 60s, yeah. Okay, so that whole thing is changing. It was interesting that where Langley Porter was the facility up here in Northern California, there was a comparable program going on down in UCLA where they had a very different approach. The approach to autism up here was psychodynamic, looking at interactions and communication, this sort of thing. Down in Southern California, they were interested in behavioral things. And so they began, and there was a person who became sort of infamous, his name I guess he's died, Ivar Lovaas. And he was a strict behavioralist. So he was approaching things from that sort of way in using extreme things, including electric shock
Oh my.
and cattle prods
Oh geez.
on kids. Because
Gosh.
one of the characteristics of a child or an individual who has autism is that they do a lot of self-stimulatory behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And so some of the thought was, well, if they are, quote, stimming all the time, they can't do this, so we will just extinguish the stimming. And when there were trials done where kids who would get into these things, they would be hit with a cattle prod to see if they could stop them. So yeah, but there were not some of the restrictions on approaches to studying things that there are now.
Well, yes, thank goodness. So let me just get back
Yes.
a little bit, because I mean, this is just such a fascinating subject, and there's so many different ways we can go with this. But so originally, the DSM was considering this to be a form of childhood schizophrenia. Can you tell me, as it started to morph from that, and we started to see more, I guess, cases instead of the most severe 1 in 10,000, what would be a diagnosis of autism, and how would that be arrived at?
Well, as I mentioned to you, Cantor had come up with 8 characteristics, and unfortunately I do no longer remember them. There was an insistence on sameness, lack of eye contact, lack of communication, and I'm sorry, I can't remember.
But these are pretty much what we still see today.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Yes.
So that's one of the things about autism. This is something the diagnosis is made by observation,
Yes.
and so now that's why the DSM became really important, because however they classified it, that's what was used to do the counting and things.
Okay, but now the DSM has a different interpretation. It doesn't still call it childhood schizophrenia, does it?
No. But it still does the same. It has still have the same characteristics of, this is not something you can do a scan and say it's
A blood test.
Yeah, you can't do a blood test.
Yeah, exactly.
You say, okay, do they do this? Do they do this? Do they do this? Do they do this? And do they have 5 out of the 8 and then put it in there?
Okay, sure.
Okay, so there's still the same kind of diagnosis by description.
So originally, I'm sure what happens is a parent, usually with a young child, I imagine by the time they're a toddler, I would assume, starts seeing something that they're not developing at the same level as their peers. So is that kind of where most children get into the diagnosis, or is it when they get to school? Where are we starting to see
your first
this?
thing is more accurate. Here in the United States, we were talking about autism. In Europe, they were talking about Asperger's syndrome.
Oh, yeah.
Which is still, we've gotten rid of Asperger's, by the way, by just taking it out of the DSM.
Oh,
It's now high
Gone.
functioning. It's now high functioning autism. I mean, that gives you a sense of the power of publication.
Words and
So anyway, and besides Skinner, there were more people who were beginning to look at, well, this can't just be environmental. And I think now, at this point in time, anyone would say, what is autism? It's a neurodevelopmental disorder of unknown origin, but the precursors are multifactorial. So that, because then for a while, the idea was it's genetic.
Okay.
So you're born with it. Because sometimes these kids will be fine for the first few months, and then there's changes in their behavior. One of the criteria is the symptoms have to be available before the age of 3.
Okay, before the age of 3.
Yeah, and then parents would be the frustrating thing of being concerned about their kids and then being told, well, they'll grow out of it, they'll grow out of it,
Sure.
they'll grow out of it, and that's to a certain extent in some instances.
Depending on the level, I would think,
Right,
of how
yeah.
they're acting out or not. And
Yeah. As the incidence of things started increasing, because as I said, it was 1 in 10,000 back then. In the 60s and and late 60s and into the 70s, the DSM changed it. They changed it to a biological disorder of brain development. Is what they said.
biological disorder of brain. Okay.
Right. And there were people in Southern California One of them being Bernard Rimland, who was a psychologist, who really began questioning some things. Well, fortunately, Rimland had an autistic son.
Okay.
And so within the profession, there was a lot of finger pointing, saying, well, of course he would say it's something else because he doesn't want to be blamed. I mean, we all know it's bad parenting.
Oh, it's not genetic.
So,
Or,
yeah.
Yes. Okay.
So anyway, Rimland started being contacted by a lot of physicians, and they formed a group called Defeat Autism Now, and they were known as DAM doctors. And if you went to a physician who was a DAM doctor, you were likely going to have them thinking about a lot of biological factors that might go into it.
Okay.
So classification started changing. And I want to mention vaccines in here too.
Yes, please do.
When Canner was looking at things, the only required vaccines were the DPT and smallpox. Okay. By the late 60s, we had added polio.
Yes.
Also, measles, mumps, and rubella. And originally, measles, mumps, and rubella were separate shots.
Okay.
Okay. Then they were later combined into one.
The MMR that we all know and love.
Yes. And there was a thing that became an issue. It was called thimerosal. Thimerosal is a preservative that's put in vaccines, and it has a heavy mercury base. So on the one hand, we're saying mercury is the most toxic element on Earth. Let's put it in vaccines.
Yeah, sounds like a plan.
Yeah. There was a lot going on politically about whether or not we even needed the measles, mumps, and or rubella, because up until that point, if you look at the Center for Disease Control's statistics, it's obvious that all three of those things, as illnesses, were going down.
They kind of run their course
They
as
were
far as
going
epidemic.
down, before the vaccines were introduced.
Very interesting.
But there was still a heavy lobbying to get them in there, and they did.
Somebody was going to make some money, huh?
Yeah, yeah. But in the 70s, there were several high-profile legal cases brought against specific pharmaceutical companies because it appeared that the serious difficulties that these children were showing came after vaccination.
Way back in the 70s?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. And in the 70s, there were these, and unfortunately, I don't have the names of the cases,
Sure.
but there were several of them. And in every case, the finding was for the family and against against the pharmaceutical
Oh,
company.
I thought you were going to say just the other way around. That's
No,
fascinating.
but it has a sad thing coming out of it, because at that point the pharmaceutical companies approached the U.S. government and they said, "We're not going to make any more vaccines unless you, unless
Got you over a barrel."
Yep. And if you don't do that, and then you have to, I'm using a word here, when you're not, you can't be blamed.
Yeah, you're held harmless.
Yes.
Yes.
For any of these things, and so that's when the vaccine laws came in, where even if it's proven that the vaccine caused problems in a particular child, you cannot sue the vaccine companies.
Wow.
We have
That's
instead
incredible.
a vaccine compensation law, into which you and I and all the people who pay taxes put money.
Really?
So when there is a case that is brought, and there was one, I think 3 years ago, that attracted a lot of attention, where it was decided, pretty obvious, this kid was fine until. They are compensated not by the pharmaceutical company, but they're compensated by the vaccine injury.
Wow. Wow, that is incredible.
So that's why I said before, you can't look at that at autism in isolation, because it's so much a part of politics and.
Isn't that something? What we don't know.
Yeah.
Just incredible.
And then so the vaccine compensation law was passed in 1986.
86.
Yeah. But by then we had added now a whole bunch more vaccines.
Oh, yes, we have.
Yeah. But they took out smallpox because, they had eradicated that. Yeah. But now they were putting in the hepatitis B and the first flu vaccine. Around in the 80s, there's a real high-profile case that came up a lot. There was a gastroenterologist in England whose name is Andrew Wakefield. He was referred some children, and he noticed that they all had these severely inflamed gastrointestinal systems.
Okay.
It was parents that came to them, him with their children, because his children were in pain and in agony, and they couldn't figure out what was wrong with them and so on. So he didn't do a study. He did a case report. He looked at these various kids and what was the commonalities and what were their symptoms and so on and so forth, and the fact that they had these badly inflamed guts.
Wow.
And you may have heard the phrase leaky gut.
Yes.
Okay. Well, that's where that started.
Okay.
So he didn't say the vaccines had caused it. What he said was, there's a group of children. These are the commonalities. They have all had this and this and this and this, and here is something that's showing. And what's happening is their guts are so badly inflamed. That's why they're screaming and
Oh, my goodness.
This was noted by a journalist in Britain whose name is Brian Deere.
Okay.
Brian Deere worked for Rupert Murdoch, and for whatever reason, he decided to go after Wakefield.
Okay.
With the unfortunate result that he was drummed out of existence. His license was taken away, and the people and that's when we very first began to see the result of the fact of who is now in charge of our medical journalists and so on and so forth. Because Lancet, which is a highly respected
Medical publication.
had published the story, had vetted it themselves, and then they withdrew it. And so Andrew Wakefield has become the poster child by many, many people who say this guy had the guts to say something.
He was the whistleblower,
Yeah.
basically.
And he's now in the United States. He left Britain. If you read for example, there was in the Union recently. They said there was Broadman had written an opinion piece, and he was talking about how bad the people are who are not having their kids vaccinated.
Okay.
And he refers to Wakefield, and he says, and the whistleblower who was discredited, and everything was, proven that he was all. He said everything negative thing he could. The reality is actually there's at least 8 or more publications vindicating, saying, doing this thing again and saying, yep, it's there. So that whole thing gets involved in it.
Well, probably Rupert Murdoch gets involved in it at some level. Yes.
Yeah. So that's gotten that whole thing all going on now. But also coming along the same way here. In the United States, we did a federal law known as Public Law 94142. It was the education saying you cannot exclude a child from schools. So it was a special ed law.
Yeah. So if you can't exclude a child from school that has not been vaccinated.
No, they're not. You cannot. You cannot. See, at that time, kids could be excluded from school if they were mentally retarded, if they were developmentally delayed, if they had all kinds of things. You could say can't come to school.
Oh, just for general reasons, other reasons. Okay.
So around the same time, then all the education law started to change and said you can't do that. You have to admit a child to school. So the whole education industry got involved in this thing now. And if you're going to have kids at school, you have to have programs for them.
Yes.
So that part got involved in it too.
So special ed classrooms came into being and what
yeah,
have you.
yeah.
Okay.
And then you had more looking at, well, what can we do about this? Nobody's come up with any kind of, and then as this time was going on, there were, professionals who were having kids who fell into this category, and they were looking at what could it be, and there are people like Natasha Campbell McBride, who wrote a book called The GAPS Diet. And this G is for gastrointestinal, it's gut and psychology. How do they go together?
Yes,
Right.
I have heard of that.
And that has gotten a lot of attention because it started to change the whole thing about diet and how does that affect it. There were more and more books being written by professionals whose grandchildren were coming up with these characteristics.
Yes.
And there's another book called Children with Starving Brains.
Oh.
So there began to be more and more looking at what are these other kind of characteristics are coming in.
Yes.
But then I don't know if I managed to put down some statistics. During the 80s and 90s, that's when it was so on how autism exploded.
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to detour a minute. Because when I left Langley Porter, I was there for a long time, but by that time they weren't doing anything with autism. UCLA still was. San Francisco wasn't. And they had moved on to dealing with acting out kids and all kinds of behavioral disorders. So I wasn't paying attention to autism anymore. It wasn't until I had moved up here, and I was at that time coordinating the Child Abuse Prevention Council, and I was doing a table at the Day of the Child, and here came somebody with an autistic kid, and the mom was, frantically kind of came back, and I thought, oh, I know that kid, and so she was very startled when, she saw that I recognized what was going on and knew how to interact with him. And then I could start to find out that what was going on here and what programs there were for kids in this area. At the same time, I encountered a young woman who was a DJ on KVMR. And in the conversation sometimes she said something about the explosion of autism. And I thought, what are you talking about?
What explosion?
Yeah. What explosion? And so it wasn't until the 90s that I became aware of the fact that this thing was going up and up and up and up. And so long story short, we've gone from an incidence of something that was 1 in 10,000 to something where now it's 1 in 46.
I can't even do the math. What kind of percentage
No.
changed? I mean, that's just
Now,
simply incredible.
part of that is the artifact of the fact that the criteria and so on and so forth have changed. And there are a lot of kids that are now it's autism spectrum.
Spectrum, yes, and I wanted to talk about that spectrum, yes.
So you can go from kids who are nonverbal and non-communicative to highly intelligent, quirky kids. And they're all on that same spectrum. And they're all on that same number of things. But the projections are that by 2022, I think it'll be 1 in 50. Every other kid. It won't not be 1 in 50, it'll be less than that.
And
But either way.
so would we say that every other kid, do you really believe that every other kid will be on the spectrum?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, you do?
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. Now, but they can expand that spectrum too. So you can be including kids that. One of the reasons you asked about diagnosing, you have a bunch of lists, and do you fit here or not? But one of the reasons for getting kids diagnosed is that there are programs available if you have the right diagnostic label.
Okay, yes.
So getting that label is going to get the kids services.
Right. Well, even SSI, financial help for the families. And I know you have to have the label in order to get the help.
Yeah. And the responsible area for providing services and programs for school-aged children are the school districts. So they are dealing with kids who have communication problems. They have sensory motor integration problems. They have a wide range of things. And no really financial backing to be able to provide programs for them, but they have to anyway. So, it begins to have all those components coming together. What isn't talked about very much, and it's just, I think, in the last 5 years beginning to be recognized, is it's not everything is fine or you're autistic. There are so many other things that are happening along with it.
Shades of gray all the way
Yeah,
through.
and along with those things, we haven't seen there's allergies have increased, learning problems have increased. All the kinds of exceptionalities that make it impossible for you to develop normally have been increasing right along with it. And unfortunately, there's so much animosity between what are called the vaxxers and the non-vaxxers.
Yes.
In '89, there was something, again, it has to do with vaccines. There was a real increase in '89. I've forgotten what the numbers were. But at that time is the first time the pharmaceutical companies started to put an adjuvant into the vaccines.
Okay, an
And
adjuvant
an adjuvant is something that's designed to increase the strength of the vaccine.
the effectiveness.
The effectiveness of it, yeah. And one of the concerns is that perhaps that is something that is making an overload. So those kids who do develop symptoms and problems afterward are dealing with their immune overload.
So it could even be, I've heard that people say it could be an allergy to the additives in these vaccines.
At the same time that all this is going on, we've done things to our food supplies.
Yes.
GMOs are now, you have a hard time avoiding them.
Yeah, we sure do.
And the coalescing of those agencies that have a profit industry, interest in things.
Yeah, well, the highly processed foods.
Yeah.
I mean, again, back in the 40s and even the early 50s, I think, well, when I was growing up, that's when we had the look ma no holes and, the like chemical bread, whatever it wasn't bread. So the artificial foods movement, and then I know that the various entities will try to keep labeling to be misleading. It's just like whatever the consumer thinks they're getting is really not what they're getting at all.
No.
And so I think the average person has no idea
Yeah.
in the world what they're feeding to their families.
And you're told, read the labels. Well, I
What?
don't understand the labels.
Can't say that word.
Yeah.
Yeah. And sugars. I'm sure sugar, especially with kids' ADHD type, sugar, artificial colors, and preservatives, as we know, is huge. And take them away, and the kid's behavior changes.
Yep.
Yeah. Now I don't know about autism. There, I mean, there's all different levels, as you say.
Well, yeah. But you see, also, I don't remember where I read this. It was several years ago. That Roundup, or good old glyphosate,
Yes.
showing up in breast milk.
Oh yes, I've heard that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we have an environment that is so toxic, and then you have this, being that's born into it, and then injected with all kinds of things that seem to be making them more and more vulnerable to on so many spheres. Yeah.
Gosh, so many causes. It's just almost, I'm trying to stay positive, like where do we go from here? It's like, are we in a bubble at birth? I mean, what do we do? So it's increased. There's all sorts of environmental reasons for that, and our food supply, and so many things. What can we do? What does someone in your position now, so on an average, you're working with children and adults, and what do you do to make things better?
What happened was, it was again happenstance. There are agencies like the regional centers in California has more services in many states.
Like Alta Regional.
Yeah. So Alta Regional Center is an agency that provides services that are not available through the school district. But it's also, if one has a proper diagnosis and is accepted as an Alta client, then those services are available to you for life.
Oh, wow.
The school district's responsibility ends at 22.
Okay.
So somehow or other, my name got to Alta Regional, and I started getting referrals for psychological counseling for adolescents who are making the switch from schools.
The leap.
Yep.
The transition, age.
Yeah,
they age out, basically.
Yeah. Well, they aren't aged out yet because there's still more things you can get, but the programs are good, you don't just seamlessly go from one to the other as you do in schools for those services, because that's reviewed on a yearly basis.
Okay.
You know? And so I started getting referrals for these kids. They graduated high school. Their parents are going crazy. They can't get a job. You know, and that's what got me back into it again up here. So that's and working with the families, because this is the impact on the kids is one thing, but the impact on families is incredible. You know, it's easy to have them kind of get lost in the thing. When you say, what do we do? I guess everything is kind of like for people to, on their own, start educating themselves, and not just take for every time I see somebody's article in the newspaper, it's just a regurgitation of everybody knows that blah 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 blah. You know, I have a neighbor who's a dear friend who is so pro-vaccine. You know,
oh, sure.
And I keep saying, yeah, that's fine. If you want to have it, go ahead. But would you please do something to really find out a little bit more about this?
Yeah, educate yourself.
Yeah. So getting people to educate themselves, and that's increasingly difficult because you're often met with it's decided. There's no question about it.
Right.
We all know what it is.
Yeah.
You know, has nothing to do with vaccines, and so we won't do that. So it's hard for people who do educate them. But what's happening is that as more and more people get educated. Yes. They're not taking a back seat anymore. So there's more professionals coming out with books like Children with Starving Brains, and like the GATS diet, and those kinds of things. And there's also looking at people like there are some very successful people who would be considered Asperger's, but high function autism, that are making it well in the world. But there's the one that's best known is Temple Grandin.
Oh, yes.
There was a movie about her.
Yes.
Okay, and it's interesting, have her talk about what worked for her as a kid. And she, I want her mother to write a book.
So for those who don't know, tell us a little bit about who
Temple Grandin is well known in the cattle industry. She has, detour. One of the things about people who are on the spectrum is those who are very high functioning, they have an unusual kind of perceptual abilities.
Okay.
And so that has impact way back here when you're trying to learn how to ride a tricycle. But it also has how you look at the world. Temple Grandin is well known in the cattle industry because she designed a chute that would make it easy to have when cattle are being brought into slaughter. They would often get really panicked as they were walking, and then they would start to react, and it was very difficult. So she looked at this thing and figured out that, what was the problem was they were getting to a certain point and then they could see where they were going. And so she devised a design for getting these cattle moving in a way that they could go calmly where they wanted them, She also, and so that has had wonderful benefit.
So her empathy for these living beings.
And she also came up with realizing how much what goes on as disordered behavior really has to do with fear. And if you can't, and on a basic level, brought to look, we orient ourselves in the world through our sensory processes. But if you have sensory processes that are damaged or functioning differently, you can't trust the world. You don't know. I remember one kid. I remember one young girl who had made a lot of progress, and it had been a long time. This is way back, in the 70s. It was hard getting her to go to cross the street because she would get to the corner and she would just panic. Well, as she made progress and as she was able to communicate this, I ran into her several years afterward, and what she said was when she would look down at the street, it looked to her like it was way down there. So she was afraid to cross the street. Where would she put her foot? So and Temple Grandin's work was dealing with that in terms of how it affected this whole industry. She fortunately has become very vocal, and there's been a movie made about her, and she's written several books, and you look at illustrations of some of her drawings and how she figured this out, and they, you know, it's astounding. You know, she also developed what she called a squeeze machine. Now, way back when I was at Langley Porter, we discovered that one way when kids would have what were being seen as tantrums, maybe they were really having a panic attack, and one way that they could be calmed was if they were held, and so we developed techniques of holding them until they got past this. Well, Temple Grandin developed a squeeze machine because she also noticed with the cattle, if you put them in a situation and you would get them contained and held, you know, that they could calm down. So one of the ways that she got through college was with her squeeze machine. But she developed it, you know, she designed it and built it. And when she would get, you know, like really stressed, like it was finalist time and so on and so forth, she'd use her squeeze machine, you know, to calm her down. So, you know, obviously I got way off track here.
That's okay. It's all fascinating, and there's just so many levels of this, and so many different directions to go. It reminded me of for the dogs, the thunder jackets that they use now. As you were talking, it just kind of.
In fact, see, some of that stuff, those thunder jackets, these came out. One of the things that was there was a woman in the 70s, and her name was Jane Ayers, and she wrote a book on sensory motor integration, which had a lot of applicability to schools and things. But that was one of the things that was in there, how you can contain kids, and so many kids, and if you go into a special ed class, you'll see them with heavy jackets, weighted jackets to hold on, or you know, special seats that they can sit on and be able to rock back and forth. So which is a relaxing kind of thing.
Yes.
Also, you know. So I don't remember where I was going with that at
this
point.
I mean, we've covered so much ground, but one of the things I'd like to know, so you're seeing quite a few people now, and I'm just kind of curious as to, do you see more males, more females, or
there's
certain age groups?
There is a higher percentage of males. Not a lot different, but there's always been a higher percentage of males.
I wonder why that would be. I mean, there's just so many unknowns because there's, you know, vaccines and there's processed food and there's environmental. I wonder if it is hormonal, that it goes to the male system more than the female.
Well, you know, I think that there's no denying that there's a genetic component to things.
Okay.
So it goes all the way back there.
Okay.
Males are genetically inferior.
Oh dear! Ways. Don't listen. Men.
You know, in any of the things like stuttering is higher incidence in men and women. There are certain eye diseases.
Color blindness.
Yeah.
I wonder if it's a Y chromosome thing.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Yeah. So I mean, so there's so many things. There's so many things that could be studied and thought about and found out that more. That this is where all the political dissension gets in the way of it. You know, because who will fund and back to the vaccines. You know, what the blanket statement, vaccines. Well, if you look in anything, it says vaccines are inherently unsafe. That's in every government publication.
Okay.
So when people say it's a settled thing, vaccines are safe, no, they aren't. There are no safety studies, and one of the reasons that's really upsetting is the studies that get done are done by the pharmaceutical companies. They fund them, they do them, they publish them, they so on and so forth.
Yeah.
You know, and when something comes out like a year ago, a movie called Vaxxed,
I've heard, yes.
That has the support of Robert Kennedy. There has been every effort made to get that movie suppressed. In fact, Senator Pan, who was responsible for our mandatory vaccine things, wants that movie banned in the state of California. So when people do try to educate themselves, it's difficult.
Yeah. Follow the money.
Yeah.
Follow the money.
One of the things that's really hard on the high functioning kids is when they come out of school, they have trouble getting jobs. So a few, some of them are really good. You asked about computers. Some of them are very good at that. Some of them are great musically. They have, so there's a huge creativity about them. But they still have characteristics that get in their way.
Exactly. So even if you have, say you are, so I have a grandnephew that's 7, and from the time of 3, he's been a whiz. Put a tablet in front of him, and it's just boom, boom, boom. He wasn't verbal until about a year and a half ago. He started to, and now he's actually doing homeschool, and he's doing very well. But when you look at kids, and as they become young adults, their personality traits, if you wanted to have, even a high functioning young person on the spectrum somewhere, how they interact with their coworkers, for example,
Yeah.
or with the public, if you're working, say, in a retail job, even in a fast food environment, fast paced, a lot of things coming. So what do you do? So you've started to see these young people, they've been being referred to you. So I'm curious now, what is the good news? What can we expect? And how do you help them to the next level?
There isn't an awful lot of good news.
Yeah, that's not what I wanted to hear.
I know. It's not what I wanted to say either.
Yeah.
You can help kids learn, okay, who are high functioning. What skills do you need to get through an interview? One thing that we, as a culture, prize highly is eye contact. Now, not all cultures do, but we do.
Yes, we do.
And so if you're a kid who can't make eye contact, and I used to teach kids really early on, don't look in their eyes, look right here. Just figure out, imagine a little dot right there, look at that dot, and it appears that they're making eye contact. So teaching kids tricks to get through this. What kind of thing can you expect? How can you respond to this sort of thing? And it's interesting that this is all becoming so prevalent now. There are now programs run by universities to get kids to teach them how to go to college.
Okay.
So there's one in Fresno called Wayfinders. There's another one in Berkeley called College something or other CIP is its acronym. What they're doing is taking these kids. Okay, we can help you get through the academic stuff, but here's what you have to learn for this, and here's what you have to learn for that. And so they're literally teaching kids how to go to school. These kids being now young adults. But it's so prevalent that they're popping up all over the sad thing is they're very expensive.
Yeah.
So if you have the good fortune of coming from a family with great resources, you can get some help to do that.
Well, when I hear you say that, in the not too distant future, we're looking at 1 in 50. Obviously, things are going to have to.
50%, not 1 in 50. I said 1 in 50. I correct myself. 50% of the kids will be on the spectrum.
So obviously things will have to change. I mean, there will have to be, for 50% of the population that's going to be replacing us as we exit.
Yeah.
Obviously there's going to have to be a difference in how things are done across the board. So, for example, now we have vocational training and for anybody and everyone. And we have programs like FREED here, Center for Independent Living and things like that. But it sounds like we're going to need a whole lot more of that as the standard across the board that will not be privately paid for.
That's right.
So are there any legislators or anyone out there looking at the very near future?
Not to my knowledge. And there may be. I don't know.
But nothing that's well known in the trade or the field. Or...
And one of the things that's hard is for families who have been able to take care of their kid, but they're coming out to the end of their life. And that sort of thing.
So special programs. Well, Danita, I think we need to do a part 2 on this because this it's just fascinating subject, and we're all going to be affected by it.
Yes.
I mean, we're affected by it now.
Yeah.
But not necessarily just in our own personal family, but every walk of life.
Yeah.
Every walk of life. So I think this is a huge subject. I want to thank you so much for the work that you do and have been doing. And what a resource. Huh. Geez, I mean, just what's in your brain. So let's have a part 2. Let's talk about this again. And I think if anybody has questions, they can certainly get them to us here at the farm. Thank you so much, Danita Sorenson, for being here with us today. And stay tuned, there'll be more.